Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to mislead the jury.
This is about the facts, and you cannot escape them.
He's my father. You're just the man babysitting him until he dies. He asked me to stay. And when he's gone, you leave. That was never your family to keep. The car's waiting, Rochelle. We have a flight. That's all he was ever good for. The woman who had just reduced 16 years of marriage to a single rejection had no idea she was already too late. Rochelle walked out that door certain that when her father was gone, she would inherit everything and sell it before the week was out. She had figured out the value of every clinic, every building, but she had never once figured out the man she was leaving behind. What kind of proof does a dying man leave when he already knows exactly what his daughter plans to do with his life's work? If stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and the people who quietly hold everything together speak to you, subscribe. There's a lot more coming. There is a special kind of silence that settles over a house when someone inside it is dying. It isn't emptiness, it's weight. Every room holds it differently. The kitchen holds it in the smell of food going uneaten. The hallway holds it in the light left on past midnight because someone forgot to turn it off or couldn't bring themselves to. I had learned the feel of that silence over the months I spent caring for Walter Bennett, and I had come to understand that it was not something to be fixed or filled. It was simply the sound of time moving slowly towards something sure to happen, and the only honest thing a person could do was stay present inside it. I had been married to Rochelle for 16 years. Long enough to have built something real, or at least something that looked real from the outside, a shared life in Atlanta. A marriage that survived the hard years when I was still working overnight shifts in the emergency department, and she was taking classes 3 nights a week on a schedule that left us crossing paths in doorways more than sitting across from each other at tables. I didn't resent those years. I understood then as I understand now that building something takes time and sacrifice given unevenly, and that the person who carries more for a while is not owed a list to be settled later. You do it because the thing you're building matters, because the person matters. What I couldn't have told you then, what I only understood slowly watching Rochelle become the woman she had always wanted to be, was that the version of her I had married and the version she was becoming were not the same person. Change didn't arrive all at once. It came in small steps I kept explaining away. I remembered a version of her who brought food to my hospital break room on bad shifts, who sat with her father on Sunday afternoons and sang old songs she claimed not to know the words to. That woman had been real. I was certain of it. What happened to her was more complicated than I had words for. It came with every new title, every year Tristan spent telling her she deserved something larger, every morning she looked at the life we had built together and decided it wasn't enough. I didn't hate who she became. I only carried the quiet ache of remembering who she had been. Walter Bennett had not trusted me easily. That was fair. He was a man who had built Bennett Community Care over 3 decades with his wife Margaret Holloway before they married, and he protected it with the careful watch of someone who understood that the things you love most are always most open to harm from the people closest to them. When Rochelle first brought me home, Walter looked at me the way a man looks at something he isn't sure yet is strong, studying the load-bearing points, waiting for the first sign of weakness under pressure. I didn't take it personally. I let time do the work that argument couldn't. The trust came quietly the way it usually does. Not through a gesture or a statement, but through a sequence of ordinary moments that built up into proof. The time I drove 2 hours in a rainstorm to fix a broken HVAC unit at one of his clinics because the maintenance crew couldn't reach anyone else. The evenings I sat with him while Rochelle was traveling for work, listening to him talk about Margaret, about the early years of the clinics, about patients who had come back to volunteer after their own recoveries. Walter began to tell me things he hadn't told anyone else, not because I was special, but because I was steady, and steadiness was the quality he respected most in a person. During one of those evenings, he mentioned Margaret's maiden name Holloway, and the way he said it told me it was a name he kept close, a name that belonged to the part of his life he was most proud of. Rochelle's success was real, and I was proud of it. She had earned her MBA through real effort and taken Bennett Community Care from a community place into something with regional reach and professional management. But somewhere in that change, the clinic stopped being her father's life's work and started being an asset she was responsible for maximizing. I watched it happen and said nothing, partly because I didn't know how, and partly because I told myself I was wrong about what I was seeing. I was not wrong. Tristan Cole had been in Rochelle's circle for nearly 2 years before I understood what he was to her. He was the founder of a real estate investment fund, polished in the way that men are polished when they have spent years presenting themselves to rooms full of money, and he had seen Bennett Community Care's property size as big enough to be worth chasing through whatever path was most efficient. That path, it turned out, was my wife. When Walter's diagnosis came, pancreatic cancer late stage, the kind of news that arrives with a clear timeline already attached. Rochelle's response was to manage the situation the way she managed everything efficiently from a distance with the idea that other people would handle the parts that required being there in person. She said she would reduce her travel schedule. She said it the way people say things they have already decided they won't do. I closed the workshop for the time being without discussing it with her. I had built that place over 12 years, equipment sourced piece by piece, relationships with hospital buying offices built through reliability and fair pricing. A small crew who knew the work well enough that I trusted them completely. Setting it to pause was not a small thing. But Walter was at the point where he needed someone in the house, not just someone stopping by, and Rochelle wasn't going to be that person. I simply did it because it needed to be done and I was available to do it. The day Rochelle told me she was going to the Maldives was not the day I understood what had been happening. That understanding had been building for months. But it was the day I stopped being able to explain it away. Walter had maybe 8 to 10 weeks left by the most hopeful estimate his comfort care team had given us. I asked her to stay at least through her father's birthday, which was 11 days away. She said Walter had nurses, had me, had everything he needed. The word indefinitely landed the way it was meant to, as a reframe and implication that what I was asking was unreasonable. What she didn't tell me before she left was that she had taken $850,000 from the clinic maintenance reserve. I found out through the fund administrator, who called asking about a shortfall affecting 2 of the clinic's ability to restock medications and meet payroll. When I reached Rochelle, she was brief and unapologetic. The money was an investment, she said. She'd sort it out when she returned. That was when she told me about Tristan. Not as a confession, as information. She said the marriage wasn't working and hadn't been for a long time, and that she intended to file for divorce. She sent the papers the following morning along with a note saying I could stay at the house to care for her father, and that after Walter passed, I should make arrangements to move out. Walter had heard the last part of our conversation through the open door of his room. He didn't tell me directly. He told me instead the following evening that he needed to meet with his attorney, that it was something he should have attended to earlier, and that he wanted me present when it happened. I told him he didn't need to do anything on my account. He said it wasn't on my account. It was on account of his patients, his staff, and the promise he'd made to Margaret the year they opened the first clinic, that the people who came to them without money or insurance would never be turned away as long as the doors were open. The attorney came 3 days later along with Walter's primary care physician and 2 independent witnesses. Walter answered every question they put to him about his understanding of his estate, his intentions, and the legal actions he was authorizing. He was precise, oriented, and consistent. He took 2 actions that afternoon. The first was a transfer of 51% of Bennett Community Care's voting shares into Bennett Legacy Trust, a permanent community trust registered under state law in a form that could not be dissolved, altered, or challenged through standard probate proceedings. The transfer was completed as a legal act between living parties, not as an inheritance, which meant it existed independently of anything that might happen to his will afterward. The second action was an amendment to his estate documents naming me as the administrator of that trust with a fixed salary and a clear mandate: maintain the clinic's community mission, prevent any sale or conversion that would reduce patient access, and report annually to an independent oversight board. Before the attorney left, Walter asked the physician to record a video statement. He answered questions on camera for 22 minutes demonstrating recall, reasoning, and deliberate intent. He then looked directly at the camera and said he wanted to leave a message for his daughter that if she chose to challenge what he had done, this recording would be the first thing the court would see. He told the attorney to seal it and release it only if the will was contested only before a judge and only through independent legal counsel, not through any family member. He said he hoped it would never need to be opened. After everyone left, Walter and I sat in the small room at the back of the house. He said that the hardest thing about watching someone you love make a choice that damages them is that you can't undo it for them. You can only decide what you're willing to hold in the wreckage. I didn't ask him what he meant. I already knew. Walter had 2 requests in the weeks that followed. The first was that I not contact Rochelle on his behalf. No calls asking her to come home, no messages framed as appeals to her conscience. He said if she returned, he wanted it to be because she had decided to, not because she had been managed into it. The second request was that we continue visiting the clinics when he had the energy. He wanted to see them while he still could, and he wanted to see them with someone who understood what they were for. We went twice in the final 3 weeks. The first visit was to the Southwest Atlanta location, the original clinic, the one Walter and Margaret had opened in the 1990s in a converted storefront with second-hand exam tables and a waiting room that held 12 people if they were willing to sit close. The staff there had known Walter for decades. They called him by his first name, which he had always insisted on, and they greeted him without performing sadness. He sat in the break room for nearly an hour and talked with the nurses about caseloads and a patient in her 80s who had been coming in monthly for 3 years and had recently started bringing vegetables from her garden as payment because she had no other way to say thank you. Walter didn't say much on the drive back. He sat in the passenger seat and watched the city go by and eventually said that the vegetable woman was the reason he had never been able to sell. Not the mission statement, not the legacy, just her and the 1,000 people like her who had nowhere else to go. I sent Rochelle a message every evening as I had since she left. I kept them factual, how Walter had slept, what he had eaten, whether his pain was being managed. She read them, the delivery receipts confirmed it, but she didn't respond. I interpreted it as the behavior of someone who had made a decision and was afraid that any acknowledgement would complicate it. Walter recorded an audio message for her on a Thursday afternoon 12 days before he died. I wasn't in the room when he made it, but afterward he handed me his phone and asked me to make sure the file was sent. I forwarded it without listening. Whatever he wanted to say to his daughter was between them. I found out later through Rochelle's own account at the will reading that she had listened to it on the evening of a dinner event she attended with Tristan. She listened to it for 40 minutes. She did not call. She did not book a flight. Walter had told her in that recording that the door was still open if she chose to walk through it as his daughter rather than as his heir. She chose not to walk through it. He died on a Sunday morning before 6 o'clock when the light was just starting to come in through the east-facing windows of his room. I was holding his hand. The hospice nurse was present. His last words spoken the evening before when he was still intermittently coherent were addressed to me. He said thank you for not letting him die alone. I called Rochelle 20 minutes after. Her first question before she offered any acknowledgement of what I had just told her was whether her father had signed any additional documents before he passed. I told her he had handled his affairs and that everything would be explained at the reading. She arrived 2 days later with Tristan and 2 attorneys. The funeral was attended by people I had never met. Former patients, clinic staff going back 15 years, community board members, a retired judge who had served with Walter on a healthcare access committee. The speeches were given by people who knew him through his work. Rochelle sat in the front row and received condolences with the composure of someone performing grief rather than experiencing it. The will reading was scheduled for the following afternoon. The attorney explained the 2 legal actions Walter had taken before his death. The trust transfer completed as a transaction between living parties and therefore outside the jurisdiction of the estate, and the will amendment naming me as administrator. Rochelle received the remainder of Walter's personal estate, the family home, personal accounts, and 24% of non-voting company shares. The remaining shares were distributed among long-term employees and the patient welfare fund Walter had established in Margaret's name. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except me. Rochelle said I had manipulated her father. She said it directly, looking at me rather than the attorney. She said I had exploited his illness to position myself as his confidant and had used that access to extract a legal arrangement that gave me control of a $90 million enterprise in exchange for a few months of caregiving. I didn't respond. There was nothing useful to say in that room that wasn't already in the documents. Tristan's plan became clear within the week. Rather than challenge the trust transfer directly, he focused on the will. If the amendment could be challenged on grounds of unfair pressure, the court might appoint a neutral administrator during proceedings, creating a window to pressure the board into approving a sale. He had Rochelle file a formal contest within 72 hours. The court granted a temporary freeze on trust transactions and suspended my administrative authority. Within days, Tristan had approached the Bennett Community Care Board with a preliminary sale agreement, framing it as a financial rescue given the operational uncertainty. 2 clinics were already struggling with the supply shortfall Rochelle's withdrawal had created, and the frozen accounts made it impossible to address the gap through normal channels. The hospice center had 9 days of comfort medication supply remaining. I called my workshop manager that evening and told him I was selling. The buyer had been interested for 2 years. I signed the papers the following morning and had the funds transferred by the end of the week. I didn't announce what I had done. The clinic staff found out when the new owner came to collect the keys. What I didn't anticipate was the effect it had on the people who worked for Walter. When word had spread that I had sold my own business to cover their wages, something shifted in the way they talked about the situation. I began receiving quiet messages from clinic staff offering to provide statements about what Walter had been like in his final weeks and about what they had observed during that time. My attorney had located records confirming Walter's mental state at the time of the trust transfer and will amendment. But the physician who had served as a primary witness had withdrawn his supporting statement, and the timing of his withdrawal lined up exactly with the date on which Tristan's fund acquired a majority position in the debt of the hospital where that physician held his clinical role. Tristan's offer arrived through middlemen, $5 million if I surrendered the administrative role, and confirmed Walter had not been fully competent when he signed. The alternative was long legal fights that would outlast my ability to fund a defense. Rochelle came to see me separately without the attorneys. She looked tired in a way she usually managed not to. She said she was willing to end the legal challenge on the condition that I came back, signed off on a structured sale, and accepted a marriage that existed in name only going forward. I asked her because I genuinely wanted to know whether she had ever loved me, or whether what she had loved was the version of me that made her life easier and stayed quietly in the background while she became who she wanted to be. She didn't answer that. She answered a different question instead, telling me that my idealism was going to cost a lot of people who couldn't afford it. I told her no. I told her I would see her at the hearing. That night my attorney called to confirm that the sealed video Walter had recorded was now eligible for submission. The conditions he had specified, that it be opened only in the event of a legal contest, only before a judge, only through independent counsel, had been met. The recording had been held securely since the day it was made. No one had accessed it, not even me. The hearing room was not dramatic in the way that courtrooms are dramatic on television. It was a mid-sized conference room on the 4th floor of a downtown Atlanta legal center, fluorescent lighting, a long table, water pitchers that nobody touched. Rochelle's legal team occupied one side. My attorney and I sat across from them. The judge assigned to the estate matter was present as an observer for the evidence portion. Rochelle's lead attorney restated the core argument that Walter Bennett in the weeks before his death had been subject to unfair pressure by a live-in caregiver who had isolated him from his family and leveraged his emotional dependence to extract a legal arrangement transferring effective control of a $90 million enterprise outside the normal channel of inheritance. He was measured and specific. He did not say I was a bad person. He said I was in a position of structural power over a vulnerable man, and that the law existed precisely to scrutinize arrangements made under those conditions. My attorney responded briefly. He said the evidence record would speak for itself, and he requested permission to enter the sealed video testimony as the primary exhibit. The video was played on a screen at the end of the table. Walter appeared the way I remembered him from that afternoon, seated upright, dressed in the clothes he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously. Hands folded in the precise way he always held them when he was preparing to say something he had thought through carefully. The physician sat to his left. The attorney and two independent witnesses were visible at the edge of the frame. The date and time stamp confirmed it had been made 6 weeks before his death. The first 20 minutes were the competency assessment. The physician asked Walter standard orientation questions, then more complex ones about his understanding of his estate, the legal actions he was authorizing, and the potential consequences of those actions for all parties involved. Walter answered each question without hesitation and without error. He explained the trust structure in his own words, identified the specific risks he was mitigating, and described the legal effect of a permanent community trust versus a standard inheritance in terms that demonstrated he understood the distinction completely. Then he looked at the camera and spoke directly. He said he wanted to address the question of unfair pressure before it was raised because he anticipated it would be. He said that Dorian Bell had never asked him for anything. Not for money, not for property, not for recognition, and not for the administrative role he was now assigning. He said he had raised the subject himself, explained his reasoning himself, and retained independent legal counsel specifically to ensure that no one could later argue that the arrangement had been constructed without scrutiny. He said he was assigning trust administration to Dorian, not because Dorian had cared for him, but because Dorian understood what the clinics were for, and that in his judgment, after 16 years of observation, Dorian was the only person in his immediate circle who would not compromise that mission under financial pressure. He then presented calmly and in sequence the evidence he had compiled regarding Rochelle's actions in the months before his death. He described the $850,000 withdrawal from the clinic maintenance reserve, the date it was made, and the fund account it had been transferred to. He described the transfer of internal patient scheduling data to Tristan Cole's real estate fund, which he had discovered through a staff member who flagged the request to him. He played the audio message he had sent to Rochelle, and he presented the read receipt confirming she had listened to it in its entirety on the evening of a dinner event more than 4 hours before she acknowledged receiving it. He said, "I gave my daughter the opportunity to come back as my daughter. She was advised against it. I don't hold her responsible for every choice she made because I understand the pressures she was under. But I hold her responsible for the choice she made when she listened to that message and decided that dinner was more important than her father. That was not Tristan's decision. That was hers." The room was very quiet. Rochelle's attorney made a brief attempt to reframe the video as evidence of Walter's emotional state rather than his legal competence. My attorney noted that all documentary evidence Walter had referenced, the withdrawal records, the data transfer logs, the audio file and its read receipts, were independently verifiable and had been submitted as separate exhibits. The physician's original signed statement attesting to Walter's cognitive capacity was in the record. The fact that the physician had subsequently withdrawn that statement was also in the record, along with the timeline showing that the withdrawal had occurred 17 days after Tristan's fund acquired a majority position in the debt of the hospital where the physician held his clinical role. The correlation between those two events was not circumstantial. It was documented, dated, and now before the court. The judge asked for a brief recess. When she returned, she confirmed that the competency record was sufficient on its face to sustain Walter's legal actions, that the evidentiary weight of the video combined with supporting documentation did not support a finding of unfair pressure, and that the physician's withdrawal would be referred to the state medical board, and to an independent investigator for review of potential witness interference. The challenge to the will was denied. My administrative authority over Bennett Legacy Trust was confirmed and reinstated. Tristan left the building before the session formally closed. He did not speak to Rochelle on the way out. She found me in the hallway afterward and stood there without saying anything for a moment. The composure she had maintained through the entire proceeding had not broken. It had simply run out, leaving only what was underneath. She said she was sorry. She said it quietly without strategic framing, and I believed she meant it in whatever way she was currently capable of meaning it. I told her I accepted that. I told her it didn't change what needed to happen next. She asked if they could still make it work if she walked away from the sale. I told her that I had spent a long time believing that if I stayed consistent, if I showed up, did the work, held the thing together, that would be enough. And I had been wrong, not because the effort wasn't real, but because you can't hold something together that the other person has already decided to walk away from. The months that followed were administrative more than emotional. The $850,000 Rochelle had withdrawn was restored to the clinic maintenance fund as part of the divorce settlement. The preliminary sale agreement Tristan had been pressuring the board toward was formally withdrawn. The investigation into the physician's statement withdrawal was referred to the appropriate bodies, and its outcome a professional censure was on record in a form that could not be undone. I did not recover the workshop. The sale had been completed, and the new owner was running it competently. I had built it once. I understood I could build something else when the time was right. Some sacrifices don't net out. You make them because the alternative is worse, and you live with the remainder. The clinic staff submitted a proposal to name one of the examination wings after me. I declined and asked that it be named instead for Walter and Margaret for both of them together, using her maiden name alongside his, the way they had always operated side by side in service of something larger than either of them alone. The oversight board approved it without debate. I found Walter's letter on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, tucked inside the cover of a worn book on his nightstand. The envelope had my name on it in his handwriting. He wrote that I had not become his son by caring for him. He wrote that I had become his son by keeping a promise even after the person I made it to had stopped keeping hers. He said he hoped I understood the difference because the first was something anyone could do under the right circumstances, and the second was a matter of character. I sat in that room for a long time after reading it. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because the letter said something I had needed to hear and hadn't known I needed until I read it. A year after the hearing, I was locking up after a board meeting at the Southwest Atlanta Clinic when I noticed a figure standing across the street. It was Rochelle. She was looking at the building at the new sign above the entrance that read Bennett Holloway Community Care Center. The name Walter had once told me about on a quiet evening when he talked about Margaret. She didn't cross the street. She stood there for a while looking at the light in the windows and the people visible through the glass, staff finishing their shifts, a few late patients, the overnight intake coordinator setting up for the evening. I could see her face well enough to know she wasn't performing anything. There was no audience. She was simply standing there looking at what her father had built and what she had chosen instead of it. I didn't go to her. I had forgiven her not as a gift to her, but as a release for myself because carrying that weight forward would have cost more than it was worth. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration, and there was nothing left between us that required me to cross the street. I turned the lock, checked that the entrance was secure, and walked to my car. Marriage is not proven on the day you say the vows. It is proven on the days when there is nothing left to gain from keeping them, and the person you discover yourself to be in those moments is the only version of yourself that finally matters. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever shown up for someone who didn't show up for you and chosen to keep your integrity anyway, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And subscribe so you're here when the next story comes.